Jill Gardner.
Step forward, please. Raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give is true and correct, so help you God?
I do.
Have a seat in the witness chair. And if you would please sit forward and speak directly into the microphone.
Can you please state your name?
My name is Jill Gardner.
And Ms. Gardner, what do you do for a living?
I'm a preschool teacher with the Thomas School District.
And where do you work?
Pickwick Early Childhood Center.
Is that Pickwick, was it previously known as Agassiz?
Yes, ma'am.
How long have you been a teacher?
This is my 29th year.
And you said you're a preschool teacher? Is that
Yes.
Would Cloe Chandler have been a student of yours?
Yes.
Would she have gone to preschool with you during the 2017-2018 year?
I believe that was the year, yes.
Do you recall what months that would have been?
It would have been August of that year to first week in June, probably.
Do you know how many school days she would have missed that year?
I know it's very few, and when I looked back at the progress report, it was only 4 days.
In preschool, that's an afternoon program, or at least it was then?
It was at that time. She was there just for the afternoon, 2.5 hours.
So she spent 2.5 hours every day with you?
Yes.
Can you tell me a little bit about what Chloe was like?
I think the best way to describe her is just the little girl that skipped down the hall. She was very excited about being at school, and she loved learning new things, and she was excited just to try anything new.
So a very happy kid.
Yes.
Over that year, did Chloe make progress at school?
Yes, she did.
And you mentioned a progress log. Do you keep a progress log for your students as the year goes on?
Yes, we do.
Your Honor, may I approach?
You may.
Ms. Gardner, I'm showing you what's previously been marked as Defense Exhibit K2. Can you take a look at that for me? Is that the progress log that you were referring to?
Yes, it is.
Your Honor, at this time I would move to admit what has previously been stipulated by the parties as Defense Exhibit K2.
Any objection? Okay, Defendant's Exhibit K2 is received.
Ms. Gardner, can you briefly explain for the jury how Chloe would have progressed throughout that year?
She came in, I guess, pretty typical of a lot of my students. She didn't know a lot of letters, letter sounds, or anything like that. And we check it 3 times a year. At the end of the year, she knew all of her uppercase letters, all lowercase except Q. She knew no letter sounds. She knew like 19 letter sounds, which a lot of kids struggle with that. So I thought that was pretty amazing. She was counting up to 30. She wasn't rhyming or doing a lot of those kind of skills when she started, but she left with those skills. So she worked very hard.
So she did pretty well as the year went on.
Yes, she did.
Did you have any concerns about Chloe's well-being?
No, I did not.
Did she appear well-dressed every day?
Yes.
Did you have any concerns about whether or not she was being fed?
No.
Did she ever come to school looking like she needed a bath?
No, she didn't.
I want to talk with you a little bit about her parents' involvement. Can you tell me how many interactions you would have had with Kelsie Thomas that year?
I'm not sure of the number, but I know things like she was at, they came to both parent-teacher conferences. They were at the field trip that we went to Des Moines to the Blake Park Zoo. They were there for we went up our graduation day. I know several times she would drop her off or pick her up, but more than likely she went to our RAP program, which is our before and after school program. I know on a few occasions that she would bring her to school. She would make sure to tell me whether she was to go to that program after school that day or not.
And so this RAP program, can you explain that a little bit for the jury today?
It's just basically like a daycare. It's for parents that work so that they can drop their, if they need care before and after school for their children.
So you would see Ms. Thomas if she dropped Chloe off at school, but if Chloe went to the RAP program after school?
I typically did not see her, no, yeah.
What's that, I'm sorry?
I typically didn't see her then if she went to RAP.
To RAP after school.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a yes?
Yes.
You also mentioned this field trip to Des Moines. Can you explain that a little?
We used to take a yearly field trip to Des Moines. A lot of times, and we would invite the parents to go because of the large number of kids we were taking with us to help with supervising. I know that Chloe took the bus with us that morning up, which is most of our kids do because they don't get to ride the bus, so it's pretty exciting to ride the school bus. And then a lot of the parents will take the children home with them because they'll choose to stay later at the zoo because we have to get back so early before the other kids get dismissed from school, or they'll do some shopping or something in Des Moines. And I believe that she rode the bus with us and then went home with her parents.
And how about the graduation ceremony? What would your interactions with Ms. Moines have been like on that day?
I think they were very positive as I can remember. I remember taking pictures with Chloe and saying our goodbyes.
Thank you. And you saw Kelsie at both parent-teacher conferences,
Yes.
is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And were Kelsie's interactions with Chloe appropriate on those occasions as well?
Very appropriate, yes.
And why do you say that?
I like the first one. I don't remember the second one as well as the first one. The first one, since our kids got dropped off and picked up in the gym, the parents didn't bring them to the classrooms. It was exciting for their parents to be in their room. And I remember Chloe was so excited about showing them everything that she did in the room. And I remember Kelsie was very patient and kind with her. And she said, well, how about we have our conference and then we can see your room. And so we sat down and had our conference. And I remember Chloe just being excited about showing them everything in the classroom.
Did Kelsie appear to you, from what you observed, to be a responsible parent?
Yes.
And in what ways?
I know a few times when she was gone, she would call to tell me that, she had an appointment or was sick, that she wouldn't be there. Yeah, I can't remember anything specific, but I don't remember Chloe not having things, so that if I sent a note home saying we needed this for class or we were going to be doing something, or whether Chloe always had what she needed.
Were there any red flags or anything that struck out as odd to you?
No.
So any concerns at all about Chloe's home life?
Pardon?
Any concerns at all about Chloe's home life?
No.
And as a teacher, you're a mandatory reporter, is that correct?
Yes.
Can you explain what it means to be a mandatory reporter?
It basically means if I suspect that there's any kind of abuse going on, that by law I'm required to report that to DHS.
Did you notice or suspect any type of abuse with Chloe?
No, I did not.
What was your reaction to hearing the news that Chloe had passed?
Objection. Relevance.
Objection overruled. Witness can answer.
I was very surprised.
Was Chloe able to tie her shoes?
Yes.
Did you have many 4-year-olds who were able to tie their shoes?
I think to this day she might be the only one.
Did her shoes stay tied when she tied them?
I think so because I don't remember tying them after that.
Would other kids come to her to have their shoes tied as well?
Yeah, because I used to joke with her. I said, now that you've learned, you can tie all the shoes in the room.
Thank you. I have nothing further, Your Honor.
Cross.
I have no questions, Your Honor.
You may step down. May this witness be excused.
Yes, Your Honor.
You may also be excused and leave the courtroom if you choose to do so. Defense may call next witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Defense calls Dr. Thomas Young.
Step forward, please. Raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give is true and correct, so help you God?
Yes.
Have a seat in the witness chair. Go ahead, Mr. Cook.
Thank you, Your Honor. Please state your name.
My name is Thomas, Thomas Young, Young.
And sir, what is your profession?
I am a forensic pathologist.
Do you hold any board certifications?
Yes,
And what certifications do you hold?
I am certified by the American Board of Pathology in anatomic, clinical, and forensic pathology.
Where are you currently employed?
I am self-employed. I work out of my home in Kansas City, Missouri.
And what is the name of your company?
Heartland Forensic Pathology, LLC.
And how long have you been running Heartland Forensic Pathology, LLC?
Full-time since January of 2007.
What kind of services do you provide at Heartland Forensic Pathology, LLC?
If there are people who need the services of a forensic pathologist, I offer my services.
Are there any other professional roles you are currently engaged in?
My practice is basically 100% forensic pathology. Much of what I do out of my own home office is consultation. I do, however, perform medical examiner services on a temporary basis in some places.
Okay. Are you also currently a lab director anywhere?
Yes.
And where is that at?
I am the clinical laboratory director for the Putnam County Hospital in Unionville, Missouri.
Okay, and you just mentioned some part-time contract work that you do as a forensic pathologist, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Can you describe that to the jury, please?
Right now I have an arrangement with the Centers for Disease Control to provide medical examiner services for West Virginia. So I travel out there about every 2 weeks and perform autopsy. Currently our country is undergoing a big opioid epidemic, and West Virginia is perhaps the worst in the country. So they are overwhelmed with cases in which there are drug deaths, but they don't have enough personnel to be able to perform the autopsies.
Okay. And so this part-time forensic pathologist work that you're doing, is that any different than a medical examiner's work?
No, it's the same.
Okay. Dr. Young, do you have a current resume or CV?
Yes.
May I approach, Your Honor?
You may.
Dr. Young, I'm going to hand you what I previously marked as Defense Exhibit I-2. Do you recognize what that document is?
I do.
And what is it?
It is a copy of my curriculum vitae.
Generally speaking, does that document list your academic and professional accomplishments throughout your career?
Yes, sir.
And is the information contained in your CV accurate?
It is.
Your Honor, at this time I would move to admit Dr. Young's CV Defense Exhibit I-2.
Any objection? Defendant's Exhibit I-2 is received.
Dr. Young, I want to talk to you a little bit about your credentials. Can you tell the jury about your experience and how you became a forensic pathologist beginning from medical school?
I attended and graduated from medical school at Loma Linda University School of Medicine in Loma Linda, California. This is Southern California. I attended school there for 3.5 years, from 1977 to 1980. Following medical school, I performed a residency and internship in anatomic and clinical pathology at the Medical Center at Loma Linda University. Following that, I spent 3.5 years of active duty service in the United States Air Force as a hospital pathologist. And then following that, I did a fellowship in forensic pathology in Atlanta, Georgia. This was from 1988 to 1989.
And as I look at your CV, Dr. Young, it appears that you've worn a few different professional hats at the same time at different points in your career. Is that true?
Sure.
For instance, while you were the medical examiner for the Georgia Bureau of Investigation from 89 to 95, you were also simultaneously serving as associate medical examiner for Fulton County in Atlanta. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And while you were doing that from 91 through 95, you were also teaching pathology to medical students at Emory University School of Medicine. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Likewise, after you moved to Missouri, you were the chief medical examiner for Jackson County in Kansas City, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you were also simultaneously serving as Platte County Clay County and Cass County at various times while you were also serving as the Jackson County Medical Examiner, correct?
Yes, sir.
Dr. Young, is it correct to say that you've been engaged in forensic pathology full-time since 1988?
Yes, sir.
Has there ever been a time in your career since 1988 in which you faced disciplinary measures, a censure, whether founded or unfounded, anything like that?
No, sir.
Based on your CV, would it be correct that from the beginning of your career in 1988 until approximately 2006, you worked as a forensic pathologist for one government entity or another, whether that be federal, military, or state, conducting autopsies, doing similar work to a state medical examiner?
Yes, sir.
And all of that would be in addition to your experience teaching medical students both in Georgia and in Missouri while you were acting as a pathologist, correct?
Correct.
Dr. Young, have you authored any books or articles in the area of forensic pathology?
I have.
And to give the jury some context as to how your experience can help them understand the medical dynamics in this case, Dr. Young, I'm going to confirm with you some of your publications that appear in your CV. Is that all right?
Certainly.
In 2000, you co-authored a letter entitled Restraint Asphyxia that was published in the American Journal of Forensic and Medical Pathology. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
In 2008, you wrote an article entitled Forensic Science and the Scientific Method. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
In 2009, you wrote an article entitled The Inferential Test for Expert Testimony, correct?
Yes, sir.
In 2010, you authored a letter entitled Do Resuscitation-Related Injuries Kill Infants and Children, correct?
Correct.
In 2011, you wrote an article entitled Putting It All Together, The Logic Behind the Forensic Scientific Method and the Inferential Test. Is that correct?
Correct.
Now, doctor, as the jury just heard, you've written several articles in this field and specifically on the topic of the inferential test. Can you tell the jury what the inferential test is and how it relates to forensic pathology?
Sure. The inferential test is basically a test to make sure that one is inferring properly from evidence. Inferring meaning drawing conclusions from. The inferential test is as follows. One can be reasonably certain if witness accounts of the past are consistent or not consistent with physical evidence in the present, but one cannot reliably surmise past events from physical evidence unless there's only one plausible explanation for that evidence.
Your Honor, at this time I would ask the court to recognize Dr. Thomas Young as an expert in the field of forensic pathology.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
Dr. Young will be recognized by the court as an expert in the field of forensic pathology.
Dr. Young, can you tell the jury when it was that the defense team for Kelsie Thomas reached out to you in this case?
December 5, 2019.
And what services were you asked to perform?
I was asked to review the records and offer opinions.
What is your hourly rate?
$450 per hour.
Are you billing at your standard rate in this case?
Yes, sir.
In the course of your consultation work as a forensic pathologist, have you ever been approached by a defense attorney like myself and asked to perform a case review, but ultimately your findings were not what the defense attorney was hoping for?
Correct. That has happened.
Would it be fair to say that just because we're paying for your services does not mean we're paying for your opinion?
That would be fair.
As part of your analysis, Dr. Young, can you outline for the jury all the materials that you would have reviewed in coming to your opinion? And you may refer to any notes you might have if you have those.
Yes, sir. I looked at documents from the Iowa Office of the State Medical Examiner, including the autopsy report of Cloe Chandler. I looked at the neuropathology report or the brain examination report from the University of Iowa Diagnostic Laboratories, the heart examination report from the Jesse Edwards Registry of Cardiovascular Disease, the deposition transcript of Dr. Michelle Cavaliere, reports from the Division of Criminal Investigation, the pre-hospital care report, the Iowa Incident Report, records from All Ages Pediatrics PC, reports from the Ottumwa Police Department, and photographs from the autopsy.
Thank you, Doctor. After concluding your review, what did you do?
I did what I usually do, and that is apply the inferential process that I use as a forensic pathologist, and from them offer my opinions.
Okay. Based on your review, were you able to come to an opinion on the cause of death of Cloe Chandler to a reasonable degree of medical certainty?
Yes.
And just generally speaking, Doctor, what is your opinion? And we'll get into the specifics as you go along.
Okay, my opinion has to do with what was witnessed, not only by the mother of the child, but also by others who participated in the attempt to resuscitate the child. Looking at those statements and looking at the findings from the autopsy and other physical evidence related to the case, it's my opinion that the witness accounts, particularly the initial ones, are consistent with the autopsy findings and that there are no inconsistencies. As such, were I to offer an opinion as to cause of death, the cause of death would be hanging.
Dr. Young, since the time of your deposition on February the 13th of 2020, have you done anything additionally related to this case?
Yes.
And what is that?
If I might refer to my notes.
Sure.
Your Honor, may we briefly approach? State has not been provided with anything since deposition.
You can briefly approach.
There, I had asked you if there was anything additional you had done since the time of your deposition in this case.
And I answered yes.
And what was that?
I reviewed a transcript of testimony given by Michelle Cavaliere.
Okay. And we're not going to get into the details of that, but you did review that testimony, correct?
Yes, sir.
Did reviewing that additional testimony, let me strike that. Did Dr. Cavaliere's additional testimony convince you in any way that your initial opinion was incorrect?
No, sir.
Are there any other additional materials that you were not able to review in this case that would cause you to change your opinion?
Okay, I was made aware of sections 10 and 13 of the Division of Criminal Investigation file. I think that there were items having to do with digital media and trying to remember what number 13 was.
Cell phone extraction?
That may be it. Regardless, those items would not be relevant to my analysis.
Okay. Dr. Young, based on your review, is there anything about the fact that Dr. Cavaliere personally conducted the autopsy of Cloe Chandler that would render her opinion more accurate than yours?
Objection, Your Honor. Require motion to eliminate section 9.
Sustained.
So the jury is clear about this, Dr. Young. What parts of Dr. Cavaliere's examination are you in disagreement with? Are you in disagreement with her findings or her opinion, or both her findings and opinion?
Okay, if I understand you correctly, findings basically means what she actually saw at the autopsy. Is that correct?
Correct, Your Honor. Correct, sir.
I have no dispute with what Dr. Cavaliere saw at the autopsy.
And one of the documents you reviewed was Dr. Cavaliere's autopsy report, correct?
Yes, sir.
Do you have any reason to disagree with Dr. Cavaliere's observations and measurements, things of that nature that she made in her autopsy report?
No, sir.
So would it be accurate to say that in coming to your own opinion, you were relying on Dr. Cavaliere's own observations and measurements in informing that opinion? Is that correct?
Correct.
As part of your review of the history of this case, Dr. Young, were you aware that Kelsie Thomas initially reported having found Cloe Chandler hanging in a closet?
Yes, sir.
Further, that Kelsie Thomas reported she took Cloe down from the closet and contacted emergency responders who attempted some life-saving measures?
Yes, sir. I'm aware of that.
And I believe you testified earlier that the statements that Kelsie Thomas provided initially, as well as other witnesses, including first responders, all of that was consistent with Dr. Cavaliere's autopsy findings, the measurements and things that she observed, correct?
Correct.
As part of your review of the history of this case, Dr. Young, were you aware that Kelsie Thomas ultimately confessed to strangling her daughter, Cloe Chandler?
Yes, sir.
And again, generally speaking, and we'll get into the details here shortly, did you find that Kelsie Thomas's ultimate confession was consistent with Dr. Cavaliere's medical findings at autopsy?
No, sir.
Can you tell the jury, again, generally how your opinion deviates from Dr. Cavaliere's opinion?
Once again, I don't have any dispute with what Dr. Cavaliere saw at her autopsy. That's fine. The big difference here would basically be describing the conclusions that are drawn from what was seen at the autopsy. Dr. Cavaliere looked at the autopsy report and imagined a strangulation. I looked at the autopsy report and I just simply looked at what was said by Ms. Thomas initially and by the people who were basically taking care of the child. And I found it to be consistent with what they said, a hanging. The major difference here between Dr. Cavaliere and myself is that she's imagining a strangulation. I'm not imagining anything. I'm just simply taking what was seen and heard by eyewitnesses and pointing out that what was seen and heard by eyewitnesses is consistent with the autopsy findings.
In your opinion, Dr. Young, would Dr. Cavaliere have any basis in the medical literature or an experience to say that in this case it would be more probable that Cloe Chandler died as a result of strangulation as opposed to a hanging? Is that something that you believe she could say?
No.
Why not?
She has no way of measuring the probability that her imagining a strangulation would be correct. Her statement of probability is what you would call a subjective feeling. It would be maybe something that she would vote on if she were in Las Vegas and she were trying to figure out which team was going to win the Super Bowl. Something that she might feel in her gut, perhaps. But in terms of anything objective and scientific that she can use to measure it, there isn't any such thing. Her statement of probability is simply her intuition.
Does using items of probability work in real-life cases in pathology?
In a limited sense. If you know how many items there are, and you can basically measure it. For instance, if you flip a coin, whether you get heads or tails, it's going to be a 0.5 probability. That's measurable because you know what the information is. In something like this, where things are a lot more complex, you've got past events that are extremely numerous that go beyond beyond flipping a coin. So being able to measure probability is not anything that would be scientifically done or mathematically done.
informing her opinion, doctor, are you aware of any medical or knowledge basis that Dr. Cavaliere could reasonably do what she's claiming to do here?
No.
As you reviewed this case, doctor, were there any assumptions that you felt that Dr. Cavaliere had made in this case that impacted her ultimate opinion?
She makes numerous assumptions. Assumption basically meaning a hypothesis or a guess that is taken for granted. That's what an assumption is. Her opinion here is very, very complex and it's full of assumptions.
Speaking specifically to some of Dr. Cavaliere's testimony, doctor, I believe the jury would have heard Dr. Cavaliere claim that that there is more injury existing in this case than she would have expected to see in a hanging, as she would expect a child to lose consciousness quickly, and therefore that would have limited any thrashing about or any resistance the child would have because she's unconscious. Can you address that assertion?
This is all speculation. She doesn't really have any basis of any factual matter or any scientific literature or anything like that to be able to conclude that way. She's just basically using her intuition, her gut. Whether or not there might be more hemorrhage or less hemorrhage or whatever, in these cases, in fact, they're highly variable. And there may be circumstances and situations that can explain all kinds of things in all kinds of ways. She's making numerous assumptions.
Are you familiar with the term static hanging?
Static basically means that there's no motion. So I am assuming, maybe I shouldn't do that, but perhaps it means just simply a person who is hanging but is not being moved.
Based on your review, do you feel that Dr. Cavaliere made an assumption that this was a quote-unquote static hanging?
I don't know.
Is, in your opinion, Dr. Cavaliere failing to take into account, I guess let me strike that. In your opinion, doctor, is Dr. Cavaliere's assumption that the child lost consciousness quickly and therefore wouldn't have been thrashing around, is that a appropriate assumption to make in this case?
No, it's not an appropriate assumption.
And why not?
They have had videotaped evidence from people who have hanged themselves. And frequently during the process of the hanging, there is some jerking and moving around.
Now, Dr. Cavaliere, in her testimony, I'm sure the jury was paying attention, indicated that there may be movement, but not movement sufficient to actually move the ligature around the person's neck to create the abrasions that would be consistent with what she saw in Cloe Chandler's case. Do you agree or disagree with that assessment?
That is highly speculative. She doesn't really have any basis in any kind of scientific knowledge or fact to be able to draw that kind of conclusion. She's guessing.
Dr. Young, we're talking about the topic of Cloe Chandler's weight and the injuries that Dr. Cavaliere had observed. And I believe Dr. Cavaliere's opinion in that regard that she was surprised to find any injuries given the light weight of the child and that this was a hanging death. Are you aware of any relevant literature that would support Dr. Cavaliere's opinion in that regard?
No, sir.
Dr. Cavaliere also testified that, again, because the child was light and because the material was soft, that she was surprised to find any injury at all. Do you agree or disagree with that conclusion?
Well, 47 pounds is not light. Okay, for instance, if you were to go to a health club and pick up a barbell and stick it on a bar before doing a bench press, picking up that 45-pound weight would not be light. Also, if you were basically returning from an air flight and you were there to basically get your checked luggage and you had a piece of luggage that weighed 45 pounds, you would not consider it light because that's nearly to the limit that you would be allowed to take it on the airplane. And that takes quite a bit of effort and strength to be able to move that kind of nearly 50-pound weight. So her idea of being surprised that 47 pounds would not leave any kind of a mark stretches credulity. It's not believable.
How about Dr. Cavaliere's assertion that the ligature itself was very soft and broad, and again, she was surprised that it would have left any marks?
My understanding is that the ligature basically are pajama bottoms. And basically, if you were to take that kind of a garment, which is not padded, and be able to stretch it out, you could basically have folds and whatever that could form a ligature mark that's from 3/4 of an inch to 1 inch wide, as what Dr. Cavaliere described at the autopsy. So that particular 3/4 to 1 inch wide mark across the neck would be consistent with pajama bottom.
And just prior to your testimony, I actually had you physically observe those pajama bottoms, correct?
Yes, sir.
Is there anything, as you observe those pajama bottoms, that would be inconsistent in your view, or anything about those pajama bottoms that would lead you to believe that they could not have caused the ligature marks that you observed on Cloe Chandler's neck?
Looking at the pajama bottoms, there isn't anything that would preclude it from causing a 3/4 to 1 inch wide undulating mark across the neck, such as what was described in the autopsy report, and also featured in photographs.
Okay. And again, you reviewed all the autopsy photographs as part of your review, correct?
Yes, sir.
During Dr. Cavaliere's testimony, she indicated that, again, due to these dynamics, she was surprised to find evidence of injury beneath the skin of Cloe Chandler's neck. Do you agree or disagree with that assessment?
I don't know why she's surprised. Finding hemorrhage in the neck and in the soft tissues is a frequent finding at autopsy. It can be found even in situations where there's a natural death and the head and neck are basically have engorged blood vessels. Basically having a child that's found hanging and then manipulated in a resuscitative effort, having a finding of these kinds of hemorrhages that she's described would not be unexpected. However, what is interesting here is that the kinds of hemorrhages that are usually noted in strangulation cases are absent in this case.
Now, and we're going to address that again here in a second here, Doctor. As forensic pathologists like you and Dr. Cavaliere, do you have reference material that you look to for classic signs of asphyxia and strangulation for purposes of helping you analyze any specific case?
Well, sure. There are items that are basically in in forensic pathology textbooks and literature that address these issues, that address issues such as what is commonly seen in a strangulation.
And based on your knowledge of those materials, is Dr. Cavaliere's opinion that this was a strangulation supported by those same materials?
No.
Why not?
Often with a case, what is described as strangulation is it's a very, very violent kind of death. If somebody is using a ligature, basically either a cord or some other object, to basically stretch around your neck and block the airway or the blood vessels, that sets up a situation that is very, very violent. If anyone were to do that to any of us, we would struggle with all our might to be able to relieve that kind of pressure around our neck. One of the ways that people usually do that who are being strangled is to grab the ligature and try to pull it off. And frequently with those kinds of findings, there are usually fingernail scratches around the neck in association with whatever mark might have been made. Or if there was just basically, it was a manual strangulation, there would frequently be scratches around the neck, not from the person doing the strangling, but the person who is trying to relieve the strangulation. There are no such marks like these around Chloe's neck. It's just basically this mark without any of the scratches. Furthermore, what frequently happens is that strangulation cases are often associated with head injury, because usually when there's a strangulation going on, there may be some trauma from blunt force trauma to the head that goes on. There's no evidence of that at all in Chloe. Furthermore, there may be pinpoint hemorrhages called petechial hemorrhages that are frequently seen in the filmy coverings of the eyes, which are called the conjunctiva, or there may be petechiae on the face. She doesn't have any petechiae in those areas. The petechiae are basically in the pleural lining, which is basically the space around the lungs or in the larynx. Petechiae and those things are non-specific. They can be seen in a wide variety of deaths. They're not specific at all for strangulation. So those kinds of findings, the scratches around the neck, the evidence of head trauma, the petechial hemorrhages in the face and in the eyes, these are, and also internally, there may be some broken bones in the neck. There's the highway bone, which is a C-shaped bone that sits in the neck. That may be broken, and the areas where hemorrhage are specifically noted associated with strangulation is whether or not there's hemorrhage around the area where the bone is broken or the cartilage is broken, indicating that the break there was while the person was still having blood pressure and still living. She doesn't have any broken bones in the neck. She doesn't have any broken cartilages in the neck. In fact, usually with a hanging death, there typically are no broken bones or cartilages in the neck, because usually a person is quite gentle on their neck when they're hanging themselves. In this sort of a situation, there are no broken bones in the neck. There are no fractures. These are basically described in the literature for strangulation. There are none of these findings here in this particular case.
Now, Dr. Young, I'm sure that the jury can make note, as you commented, about the lack of scratch marks on Chloe's neck, because that was something that Dr. Cavaliere testified to in her testimony. Is it true that at one point during your consultation with the defense team, I had you take a look at some photographs specifically?
Yes, sir.
And do you recall what was depicted in the particular photographs that I asked you to review?
Well, there are these areas of pallor, of paleness that can be seen, that I believe they were thinking that those could be fingers.
Okay, and what is your opinion of that?
I really don't know. The problem with something like that is it could be all kinds of things. It's not anything that you could say, oh, this is definitely a mark of a finger. Furthermore, having an area where it's just simply pale is not an injury. It's not like a scratch or a scrape or anything where there's a damage of the skin. It just basically means that the blood vessels under the skin in that area don't have a lot of blood in them. It's just pale. So it's not really an injury. So taking something like that and reading or imagining things into it, I think, is problematic.
Okay. Just to make sure that we're covering our bases, Doctor, and I understand if sometimes your answer may be a little repetitive. Earlier in this trial, Dr. Cavaliere testified regarding the hemorrhages she found in Chloe's neck, and that they were prominent enough to where she felt that these were more consistent with a strangulation as opposed to a hanging. Again, her opinion that she didn't expect to see any injury, and not only did she see soft tissue injury, but deeper tissue injury, caused her to believe it was more probable to be a strangulation. Can you comment on that?
There have been situations where I have autopsied a wide variety of deaths in a wide variety of situations. Some of them have been natural deaths. Some of them may have been violent deaths for other reasons other than strangulation. Having hemorrhages in multiple layers in the neck and even on the back side of the neck, which she is describing, is a frequent finding. It's not really specific for anything. I could cite you many different sorts of mechanisms, everything from having blood flow restored in an area where there are leaky blood vessels, or even gravity. You know, if, for instance, if the body is found with the head down, there may even be quite a few hemorrhages in the neck. Or there may be hemorrhages in the neck and you really don't know why they're there. But it's hardly anything that you would say, wow, this is shocking or surprising. It must mean it's a strangulation rather than a hanging. That kind of thought process is foreign to me. Okay? I don't look at that kind of a finding, particularly in an instance here where she was basically found hanging. She's relieved from hanging and they're doing a full-blown resuscitative effort on her. Finding hemorrhages in that kind of a situation in the neck, which is one area that might be vigorously manipulated during a resuscitation, shouldn't really be all that surprising or shocking.
Dr. Young, you and I have discussed at one point during the resuscitation effort, I believe Corey Binge indicated that the life-saving measures appeared to cause her to go from blue to pink, or her coloring to go from blue to pink. Do you know what I'm referring to?
Yes. He makes two different statements. One of them is under testimony, where he offers testimony. He says there were no signs of life at all. However, in the ambulance report, the documentation there, which is basically made at the time everything is happening, he says that during the resuscitation, the chest compressions and the rescue breathing, that she actually turned from blue to pink. That indicates, often a change of color like that would indicate that there's still some ongoing circulation of blood. And that if you're basically providing oxygen, that circulating blood is changing from a bluish hue, which is what oxygen-poor blood has, to more of a pinkish hue, which is what oxygen-rich blood has. So there are some inconsistent comments. His testimony is inconsistent from what was written in his notes in the ambulance report. But it brings up the fact that you wonder if at some point during that resuscitative, that if she didn't even have some form of circulation going on, where her heart is pumping and blood is flowing.
And is it possible during those resuscitation efforts that those efforts would cause further evidence of hemorrhage?
It is possible.
And again, as far as Dr. Cavaliere's testimony that it would be more probable or less probable to be a strangulation as opposed to a hanging, you're not aware of any basis for that opinion, correct?
Correct.
Now, Dr. Young, based on your experience and knowledge of the literature, do you have an opinion on Dr. Cavaliere's autopsy opinion?
Objection, Your Honor. Prior state's motion on section 9.
Sustain.
Dr. Young, we've touched upon this, but in the literature that you're familiar with, does Dr. Cavaliere's opinion fit any of the classic descriptors of strangulation?
No, sir.
Based on your many years conducting autopsies, consulting in autopsy cases, and teaching pathology to med students, are you aware of any one piece of professional literature that would support Dr. Cavaliere's opinion that this was strangulation?
No, sir.
Are child strangulation cases rare?
Exceedingly rare. I've never seen a case of one.
And why are they rare?
In a situation where you have a small child, particularly even a real small child, the head is larger in proportion to the neck, and so it would be a lot easier, a lot more ergonomic to just basically to be able to smother the child than it would be to strangle him. Because the nose and the mouth are particularly accessible. That would be what would be reasonable as an explanation. Suffice it to say is that strangulation deaths in infants and small children are as rare as hen's teeth.
Because they are rare, is there any child strangulation database of information for forensic pathologists like you or Dr. Cavaliere to reference that you're aware of?
No, sir.
So earlier in her testimony, Dr. Cavaliere attempted to draw distinctions from a medical standpoint between how a child hanging victim would present as opposed to an adult hanging victim would present. Are you aware of any textbooks or literature that would inform her on her opinion?
No, sir.
And again, Dr. Young, to make sure I'm covering all of my bases here, if Dr. Cavaliere testified that for hanging deaths, the literature and her experience would show that hemorrhage is not as common or as plentiful in the neck, would you agree or disagree with that opinion?
Not as common or as plentiful in the neck as compared to what?
That, I'm sorry, Doctor, that hemorrhage in children would not be as common or as plentiful in the neck as compared to adults.
I know of no such literature on that says anything like that.
And again, so the jury's clear, what is your opinion on all of the hemorrhages that Dr. Cavaliere observed in Cloe Chandler's neck?
The hemorrhages in the neck are not specific for anything. They can be seen in a wide variety of situations. Beyond that, I can't really say. I don't want to speculate.
The types of injuries that you observed, let me strike that. the types of hemorrhages that you observed in Cloe Chandler's neck would also be consistent with some natural deaths. Is that true?
Yes.
What do the petechiae and lack of petechiae found in this case demonstrate to you?
Petechiae, which are basically tiny or pinpoint hemorrhages, if they're in the voice box or on the lining around the lungs, they can be seen in a wide variety of cases. They're non-specific. They can be seen in natural deaths as well as violent deaths. Petechiae in the face and in the eyes are also technically non-specific because they can actually be seen in natural deaths too. But one of the findings that is a frequent finding with the ligature or manual strangulation, where somebody is throttling somebody around the neck, is having those kinds of hemorrhages are common. They're commonly seen. And in this case, they weren't seen at all.
In Dr. Cavaliere's findings, she indicated a canting of the abrasion that goes upward and behind the ears for the furrow. Is that typical of a strangulation?
That's typical of a hanging. Okay, usually in a situation where somebody is suspended, the ligature is going to go up behind the ears and it's going to join in the back, frequently at a higher level than it is on the front. So having the abrasion canting upward like that is typical of hanging. It's not typical of a strangulation.
The autopsy report that indicated that Cloe Chandler suffered from von Willebrand's disease, is that correct?
It's called von Willebrand's disease.
Right. Is that correct?
That's how you pronounce it, yes.
And I apologize, doctor. Did the autopsy report actually indicate that Cloe had that particular disease?
That's not something that you would find at autopsy. Actually, to find von Willebrand's disease requires a lot of sophisticated clinical testing while a person is living.
Sure. And I apologize, doctor. I believe I'm misspeaking, but were you aware that Cloe Chandler had this particular disease? Was
Yes.
intended?
Yes.
And could the fact that Cloe had that particular disease, would that impact the appearance of hemorrhages at all?
Well, if she has a blood clotting problem, that might make more hemorrhage. On the other hand, even people without blood clotting problems can have hemorrhages in the neck, such as what was described in this autopsy report.
So even without the disease, it would be common to find the types of hemorrhages that you saw and observed in Cloe Chandler, and again, I believe even in natural deaths.
That's fair, yes.
Dr. Young, in testimony, Dr. Cavaliere stated that she would not have expected such a complicated and prominent ligature furrow in a hanging. Do you agree with that opinion in that regard?
Frequently with a hanging there is a prominent ligature furrow. So I would disagree with that.
And how about it being complicated in that I believe her testimony was that it indicated that the furrow would have been moving around on the person's neck prior to death?
Frequently there will be abrasion and furrows in the neck even if the ligature is not moving around in the neck. Whether or not it's moving doesn't really have anything to do with it. The ligature could have basically been in place and you can still get that kind of abraded furrow. Even in that situation, that's commonly seen in hanging deaths.
Does it mean anything to you, doctor, that the furrow marks are prominent on both sides of the neck?
That's consistent with a hanging, not with a strangulation.
And we've been through this a couple of times, but just to be specific, Dr. Cavaliere testified in hangings, and particularly in child hangings, the most common injury is no injury at all. Most often you would see no hemorrhage at all. Do you agree with her opinion in that regard?
The situation with the child strangulation, like I said, that's as rare as hen's teeth. But even childhood hangings are rare. Now, I have autopsied some cases where a child has hanged themselves, but this is a rare event. So in terms of being able to make those kinds of statements as if she's looked at numerous hanging deaths, I'm a little bit wary of that.
Apparently that would not be an opinion you would render.
No, sir.
In testimony, Dr. Cavaliere also had discussed how at one point during Kelsie Thomas's final confession, she indicated that Cloe was staring at her, and that somehow this indicated that Cloe was at the end of her life and exhibiting signs of being at the end of her life. Can you comment on that at all?
That sounds very imaginative. It even sounds very dramatic. But as far as it being scientific, it doesn't pass that kind of muster.
Why not?
I'm not aware of dead people staring, or nearly dead people staring. That's just kind of weird.
One moment, Your Honor. And Dr. Young, you also received and reviewed some crime scene photos for your case review, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
May I approach, Your Honor?
You may.
Dr. Young, I'm going to hand you what's already been previously marked and admitted as defense exhibits A through Z, and then A2 through G2. Can you tell the jury, are those just some of the photographs that you looked at as part of your case review?
They are.
Okay. And if I could see those, I want to draw your attention, Dr. Young, to these last two photographs that I pulled out. And these would be defense exhibits K and L. If you would take a look at those, please.
Yes, sir.
Do you recognize what's depicted in defense exhibits K and L?
Yes, sir.
And what do you see depicted in those photographs?
The pajama bottoms, the pajama pants, and they're lying on a bed in a comforter.
And in defense exhibit K, do those pants appear to be stretched out in some way?
Yes.
Did you take those photographs into account in your analysis in this case?
Yes.
Do you believe that those pajama pants are consistent with the case history that was provided initially by Kelsie Thomas regarding the version of the events that transpired?
Yes.
Is there anything inconsistent that you would note in your examination of the marks on Cloe Chandler's neck, in your observations of the pajama pants? Are there any inconsistencies that you noted?
No, sir.
And Dr. Young, we indicated we would be more specific about this, and now more specifically, if you were the medical examiner in this case, what would your opinion be?
If I were to assign cause and manner of death, you mean? On a death certificate?
If you were to assign cause of death.
Cause of death would be hanging.
And what evidence supports your conclusion?
In a situation where a witness provides an account, which is very, very detailed, and the account is consistent with the findings, there's no reason not to believe the account. And as such, I would accept it and call this a hanging.
As a forensic pathologist, in determining manner of death, what information were you taking into account? I'm sorry, cause of death.
Cause of death, basically I'm comparing what was seen by eyewitnesses to what was found in at the autopsy and other physical evidence.
Are you taking all the information into account or just some of the information?
All of it.
And as I believe you testified earlier, you're also taking into account the fact that Kelsie Thomas later confessed to this crime, allegedly, correct?
Yes.
And doctor, are you rendering your opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to the manner of death of Cloe Chandler?
I mean cause of death.
I'm sorry, cause of death.
Yes, sir.
And again, that is?
Hanging.
And before I conclude my questioning, Dr. Young, could you just again briefly summarize for the jury the fundamental problems you see and how Dr. Cavaliere reached her opinion?
Sure. I mentioned the inferential test, which goes, one can be reasonably certain if witness accounts of the past are consistent or not consistent with physical evidence in the present, which is I've just described here is what I did. I compared the witness accounts of the past to the physical evidence of the present. I'm telling you that they are all consistent, no inconsistencies. And then the rest of the inferential test goes, but one cannot reliably surmise past events from physical evidence. In other words, you can't take an autopsy and imagine or surmise the past events, because there may be many different kinds of stories, many different kinds of scenarios that can lead to the same autopsy findings. It's not reliable to do that. That's why you need to listen carefully to the people who were there at the time and see what they say and see whether or not it fits. And if what they say doesn't fit or if there's some other problem, it's possible here in a circumstantial evidence type of situation to say, well, there's only one plausible explanation, only one thing that it can be. But that doesn't apply in this case, because in this case, the account that was given here by the eyewitness is consistent with what was found at the autopsy, so there's no reason not to believe that account. And as such, that would be how I would infer. On the other hand, Dr. Cavaliere has basically eliminated those accounts, at least that first account, and basically imagined a strangulation scenario, something that nobody saw. Nobody's described as seeing it, at least in that first interview, that first statement that was given initially. And as such, that's not a reliable way to come to a conclusion. Imagining or surmising or guessing the past events from looking at an autopsy is not a good approach. That's what Dr. Cavaliere did. It's not reliable.
And in addition, part of why it's not reliable are the assumptions that you've outlined for the jury that Dr. Cavaliere made in coming to her opinion. Is that correct?
Yes, an assumption basically is a hypothesis or a guess that is assumed as true. It's taken for granted. Okay, you can't take for granted something that has not been tested reliably. A strangulation scenario, there's nobody that saw a strangulation take place. And as such, it's not reliable. It's not tested reliably. It's just simply her guess. And it's a very complicated guess. A strangulation basically means that it's not simply one event. It means that somebody intended to harm the child and went about all the things that you do to strangle a child, of which there really isn't any evidence for it. Okay, this is why it's not reliable to do what Dr. Cavaliere has done. It's important to listen to people who are actually there to see what they saw and compare what they saw with the outcome.
Thank you, Dr. I have no further questions.
Members of the jury will take a morning break. Please remember all the prior conditions. Keep an open mind. Don't close your mind. Don't talk to anyone about this case.
Regardless of whether you're in the car or on a plane, it's $450 an hour, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you have traveled and testified in other states, is that not correct?
Yes, sir.
I believe you've testified in Ohio, for instance,
Yes, sir.
Louisiana and Kansas,
Yes, sir.
Missouri and Tennessee,
Yes, sir.
Nebraska and Texas,
Yes, sir.
and then finally Illinois.
Yes, sir.
And admittedly, I don't have the most up-to-date records, but in 2009 I was able to get your invoice records. Would it sound appropriate to you or correct that you were able to earn about $150,000 from the Missouri Public Defender down there in your consultations, at least for that year?
Sounds right.
And that doesn't deviate too much from your general practice in terms of invoices for criminal cases, does it?
I don't understand your question.
Sure. You typically work for criminal defense attorneys in the criminal area, correct?
Yes, sir.
And at least that accounting of your invoices, that was not an unusually good year for you, was it? 2009 wasn't like ridiculously high for your invoices and the salary?
I don't recall.
As far as year to year, you've mostly consulted for at least criminal cases for defense attorneys, correct?
Fair. Yes.
And going to the publication you had in August 12, 2007, I believe it was called Catch 22 No More, 22 Lessons Learned as a Chief Medical Examiner. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And you wrote that book?
I did.
Now, Lesson 1 was entitled Always Be Willing to Leave Your Job, correct?
Yes, sir.
Lesson 4, Demand Good Salaries, correct?
Yes, sir.
And in Lesson 4, you actually noted, like it or not, money equals appreciation that accurately predicts human behavior, correct?
It does.
And essentially you're advocating that high money equals high appreciation and low money equals no appreciation, correct?
Yes, sir.
And then in lesson 6 you stated, if you agree to do private work, do not give it away cheaply, demand a high amount of money. After all, money equals appreciation and you should get all the appreciation you deserve.
Fair.
And through the course of your activities as a forensic pathologist, I'm sure you're familiar with Spitz and Fisher's medical legal investigation of death, correct?
Yes, sir.
That is actually kind of one of the textbooks I think you were alluding to in your direct testimony.
Yes, sir.
And that's a pretty foundational textbook in the area of pathology.
What do you mean by foundational?
When someone lists seminal works, textbooks, educational materials relating to pathology, Spitz and Fisher would usually be amongst those lists, correct?
Fair.
Now, as far as familiarity, I presume, since you noted comparisons to the literature, that you're familiar with the chapter on asphyxiation, strangulations, hangings, those types of deaths.
Sure.
And at least during your testimony on direct, you essentially noted, for purposes of Cavaliere's claim as to the loss of consciousness of this child being quick, that there is no scientific literature backing her claim.
Okay, I don't recall talking about how quickly the child lost consciousness.
During direct, were you not asked as to her assertion that this child likely lost consciousness quickly, that there was no scientific literature to back that assertion?
I don't recall that question.
You noted she was just making an assumption in that area?
I don't recall that question.
Now, as far as the medical legal investigation of death, does it not note that the amount of pressure on the neck that can bring about loss of consciousness is remarkably low?
Okay. Repeat the question, please.
Sure. Spitz and Fisher's medical legal investigation of death, at least in much like most literature, does it not note that the amount of pressure on the neck is that is necessary for loss of consciousness is remarkably low?
That's fair.
And you only need 5 or 6 pounds of pressure on the carotid arteries and jugular to cause loss of consciousness.
That's fair too.
And then they note 32 pounds is required to block the airway.
I thought it was less than that. I thought it was more like 11 pounds.
So not much at all, essentially, though.
Fair.
And then, at least in Spitz and Fisher and other literature that relies on it, isn't it consistent with that literature that at least the subtle loss of consciousness accounts for a large number of accidental hangings, especially in children?
Okay, repeat the question again.
Sure. Is it not correct that most literature, for instance, Spitz and Fisher's textbook, notes that a subtle and insidious loss of consciousness accounts for a large number of accidental hangings, particularly in children?
That's fair.
And then it goes on in terms of surveys that have been done of hangings, that judging by the circumstances under which these individuals are found, there is certainly no indication that this is a traumatic, painful way to die. Is that correct?
You mean a hanging death?
Yes.
That could be a fair statement.
And then, at least as the hanging does, just to couch that, a review of all relevant facts suggests that most hangings, whether accidents or suicides, cause a subtle and painless death.
I don't know about the painless. Usually people who do this sort of thing don't live to tell about it. But I don't know what else to say. People do hang themselves. And there are certain assumptions that are being made even in those particular items there because nobody really lives to tell about their experience necessarily. Loss of consciousness is pretty quick in that sort of situation. If you're blocking the arterial circulation of the brain, you can lose consciousness very quickly.
And at least in most fairness to Spitz and Fisher, loss of consciousness would indicate the person isn't sensing pain, at least in how we define consciousness.
Sounds fair?
Now, doesn't Spitz and Fisher also note that at least with hanging, when a twisted piece of clothing or a soft blanket is used, there may be no mark at all on the skin?
There may be no mark.
And then, later on, it notes hanging may occur without possible visible marks. A loop of soft fabric, such as a towel or scarf, may cause no noticeable injury.
That may happen.
And then blankets or sheets used for hanging are often left whole or ripped into strips and sometimes braided to make a noose. But if left whole, there may be little to no damage to the skin because of the width and smoothness of the fabric.
That's fair. There may be no mark.
And once again, just in terms of hanging, the literature indicates that injuries to the strap muscles of the neck are rare in a hanging.
Injuries to the strap muscles?
Correct.
In a hanging, that would be true. Usually somebody deals with their own neck very gently when they're hanging themselves.
But this review also doesn't just deal with suicides, but it's a survey of accidental hangings as well, is it not?
I don't know. I don't remember. If this is from Spitz and Fisher, I don't recall what he said on that specifically.
I have the chapter available, but would you disagree if that's what's noted in Spitz and Fisher?
That's fine.
Now, as far as the tongue, when it comes to hanging, isn't it common for the tongue to protrude from the mouth in a hanging victim?
It is.
And that's just because the mechanism, I guess there's upward pressure on the neck organs, and that kind of pushes the tongue outwards.
Sure.
And then also, it's noted that deep bruises sustained in a struggle or attempted self-defense may not always be apparent in death, if death followed rapidly. Is that correct?
Perhaps.
So they recommend that incisions be made in strategic locations known to be frequently injured in order to detect such damage, correct?
Sure.
And some of those procedures would be like reflection, or in other words, why it's kind of peeling back parts of the neck to find these subtle indicators.
Sure.
And you need to keep the integrity of the body so that you don't actually create what's called an artifact, correct?
Sure.
And artifacts would just be things that essentially somebody carrying out the autopsy messed up on that causes hemorrhaging or something that isn't really part of the death, it came afterwards.
It doesn't imply that somebody's messed up. Artifacts can be made that were not present in life, but just due to the nature of doing an autopsy, they can show up and be confused with something that occurred in life.
And then also going back, did you review, in coming to your conclusions, the chapter relating to child deaths of Spitz and Fisher?
Yeah, I don't recall doing that.
At least in terms of your general knowledge of the literature, would it be appropriate to note that when it comes to children, the literature indicates that their bones haven't calcified as much as maybe an adult?
That's fair.
And that just means that there's more cartilage as opposed to bone. Sorry for not using the proper term, but in a child versus an adult.
Well, I don't know that you can draw that conclusion. A bone is a bone.
And by that I just mean there's less calcification in a child, in a child than an adult in terms of their bones.
That's fair.
As far as the hyoid bone specifically, until the age of about 30, it has two halves that don't fuse till that age, correct?
Well, there may be portions of the hyoid bone that never fuse even after the age of 30.
But there are two specifically large halves that tend to, correct?
Okay, hyoid bones are very, very different in everybody. Some basically will have one particular item. Some will have a false joint on one side. Some will have two false joints, making anywhere from 1, 2 to 3 different portions on a hyoid bone. And usually these are joints, so they don't necessarily fuse, even in an older person.
Now, once they have fused, the likelihood of them breaking increases, correct? At least during a hanging, strangulation, those types of things.
I don't know that.
Now, going to your experience, you noted that you had never come to the conclusion or made a finding of a child hang or strangulation, correct?
Correct.
And I believe even hanging is fairly rare, particularly just in the literature and whatnot.
Well, hanging deaths in children are unusual.
I believe, at least in a review of your work, you had noted one child that you had done the autopsy of that died of a leather ligature hanging.
Yeah, I recall one case where the child ended up using a belt and hanging from the bunk bed, the upper post.
And that would have been the I guess one hanging child death that you have done an autopsy of?
At least, yeah.
Just generally, you're familiar with the 2009 federal government's report labeled Strengthening Forensic Science in the United States, correct?
Yes.
You've actually, I think, referenced it as recently as 2019 in your interview.
Yes.
And essentially, that report was created due to some issues that had come up in forensic science.
Yes.
I think there was an issue of a fingerprint being tracked from Spain to someone who had never been to Spain, and so a prosecution had come from that, correct?
Yeah, that's the Brandon Mayfield case.
And those 2009, that report, it had a list of recommendations, did it not?
Sure.
And you even know that, unfortunately, forensic pathology hasn't come along as far as it should compared to other sciences, just because these types of rigors weren't applied or hadn't been applied.
Okay, is that something I said?
To that effect, would you like to review the interview just to get the exact wording, or is that kind of a general gist?
Okay, I don't recall it.
Is that a general gist, though, that you would agree with?
Okay, once again, it's that forensic pathology didn't do what?
As a whole in this country, hasn't come as far as maybe other sciences in terms of reliability, partly due to issues that are identified in the 2009 report and lacking the application of that 2009 report's recommendations.
I don't remember saying that, but maybe that's the case.
Now, you're also a part of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences,
Yes, sir.
and you're aware that the recommendations from that 2009 federal report, they were adopted by the board of directors of that academy.
Okay, I don't recall what the American Academy of Forensic Sciences did officially in regard to that 2009 Strengthening Forensic Science in the United States report. They talked about it a lot.
Are you familiar with the general recommendation, would be recommendation 1 for Congress to set up an advisory board for the forensic science disciplines?
Yes?
I think the National Commission for Forensic Science is what they ended up coming up with, is that correct?
Well, they've had several things. During the Obama administration, they also had the Organization of Scientific Area Committees, the OSAC, where they set up different kinds of groups and committees to talk about different areas of forensic science.
And then recommendation 9 was a recommendation for a national code of ethics, correct?
Okay, I don't recall.
And that was actually, I was coming from the National Commission. Would that jog your memory?
Well, that's the organization that authored that treatise.
Since you're not as familiar with their recommended code of ethics, which hasn't been implemented by anyone, Would you generally agree with some of the recommendations, such as avoiding participation in any case where there are personal, financial, or employment-related conflicts of interest?
That's fine.
And then conducting full, fair, unbiased examinations leading to independent, impartial, objective opinions and conclusions.
Okay, say that again.
Another recommendation from this Code of Ethics was conduct full, fair, and unbiased examinations just for objective opinion's sake.
Sounds good.
And then finally, communicate it honestly and fully once the report is issued with pretty much everybody, prosecutors, defense attorneys, all our expert witnesses, correct?
Sounds good.
Now, in lesson 4 of Catch-22, you noted some discussions of hiring. I think it was hiring investigators. Do you remember that chapter?
Sure.
And discusses hiring competent investigators because you're only as accurate as they can be.
Sounds good.
I think the phrase garbage in, garbage out comes into play, correct?
Sure.
And then lesson 20, when you're discussing contracting outside pathologists, you noted that asking pathologists or non-pathologists lacking proper training and credentials for autopsies, that would be dangerous, correct?
Seems sure.
It could lead to essentially bad garbage coming out of the office.
Yeah, in any sort of a situation, if you're getting inaccurate factual information, inaccurate data, that will cause a whole lot of problems.
So you're only essentially as good as people that work for you.
I think in many respects that may be the case, sure.
Now, let's go back to the time you were chief medical examiner for Jackson County. That was Jackson County, Missouri.
Yes, sir.
As far as Dr. Thomas Gill, do you remember hiring that doctor?
Yes, sir.
Now, back in 2005, multiple prosecutors threatened to stop using your office due to concerns about his credibility.
Yes, sir.
And that was essentially the chief prosecutor from your county, Mike Sanders. He supported that request.
Yes, sir.
The chief county from Platte County, Eric Zand, he supported that request.
Yes, sir.
The chief prosecutor from Clay County, Cass County, and Clinton County also supported that.
Right.
All those counties were served by your office.
The only offices that were routinely served were Platte, Clay, and Cass counties. Clinton County, very infrequently. Lafayette County, which I think was on the list there, also very infrequently.
Now, it was kind of a big thing in the media, at least down in Jackson County, it seems, correct?
What was the big thing in the meeting?
This request that Thomas Gill no longer be used for criminal autopsies.
The request wasn't. Issues having to do with Thomas Gill ended up being made a big splash in the media.
And you were asked about it, and at least at the time, in 2005, I believe, you noted that you stood with them even if it meant leaving your job.
Okay, what was the question again?
Sure. In 2005, after these prosecutors made the request for you not to use Thomas Gill, at least for criminal autopsies, you had stated you stood by him even if it meant leaving your job.
Sure.
And then, and this probably goes to what you're saying as to a big splash, Frontline, NPR, and ProPublica did a joint investigation of Thomas Gill, correct?
They did.
They interviewed you for that story as well.
Sure.
Now, this was because it turned out that Gill had been forced out of a teaching position back in Oregon University back in the 90s.
And he had a lot of problems, including a DUI. He had an alcohol problem, and that reflected in his work there in Oregon as a neuropathologist, and also in his work as a forensic pathologist for Marion County, Indianapolis, Indiana.
He was actually, I think, fired for being under the influence of alcohol at that job, amongst inaccurate findings as well.
Well, after the DUI arrest, he was immediately dismissed from the job. His license to practice medicine was also suspended.
Then he also was demoted for poor performance while he was at Los Angeles County Coroner's Office, correct?
Not correct. Okay. He was asked to stay an additional year, but he successfully completed that training there at Los Angeles County.
And by demoted, I mean he was initially hired as a proper pathologist, but then was essentially demoted to a fellow, which is essentially similar as a pathology student, correct?
No, he did a fellowship there in Los Angeles, just like I did the fellowship in forensic pathology in Atlanta.
In particular, when he was in California, and also when you hired him, you were familiar with the Dr. Louis Pelfini case?
Yes.
That was essentially a case where a doctor was alleged to have strangled his wife or killed her.
No, what happened was that he found his wife dead. It was in the yard, and he said that she basically put her head in a bucket of water and committed suicide.
By what I mean is to a prosecution did take place initially in that case, did it not?
Well, what happened was that they initially looked at that and they accepted the doctor's statement. Dr. Gill did the autopsy. He found a lot of areas of injury on the face. It didn't look like something where she willfully stuck her head in a bucket of water and committed suicide. So he ended up with making an opinion that it was a homicide.
Specifically, I believe he noted it was a textbook case of suffocation.
I don't recall that.
From your understanding, when you hired him, he had claimed that the case had fallen apart due to prosecutorial misconduct.
Objection, relevance, Your Honor. I'm not sure where we're going with all this.
Sustained.
Your Honor, it goes. Can argue later, or if I may approach.
No.
Ask for a hearing.
No. Let's move on.
Eventually, prosecutors asked for him to resign, and you still stood
Objection,
by
Your
him
Honor.
after knowing all these issues.
I'm going to overrule that objection. Go ahead. You can go ahead and answer.
What the 6 area prosecutors did was they wrote me a letter and they asked me to not allow Dr. Gill to do any homicide autopsies on any of their cases. That wouldn't have been possible for me because a lot of times you don't even necessarily know if the case is a homicide or not when you do the case. And also it would basically have made me on call every day, 7 days a week. It would not have been something that I would have been able to sustain with only 2 doctors in the office.
Did you initiate looking for another pathologist to replace him and keep him working during that time period?
I don't think Dr. Gill did anything wrong. Okay. Yes, he did have an alcohol problem. He did take the physician diversion training in California. He successfully passed it. The very last time that he ever drank an alcoholic beverage was 1994. At the time he was under my supervision and hire, he did an excellent job. I think he was right in the Pelfini case. I didn't see any problem with Dr. Gill. And as such, I didn't see any reason to prevent him from doing what he needed to do. Now, I told these prosecutors that if you needed somebody to provide any kind of character witness in terms of his reliability in his work, I'd be more than happy to testify to that. But I couldn't accede to their demands that I prevent Dr. Gill from doing any autopsies because that would not have, well, it would be throwing a colleague under the bus, no good reason. He was clearly not under the influence of alcohol during any of the time that he was working in my office. We looked at him like a hawk. There's no problem with his performance. I think he was basically misjudged and mischaracterized by a lot of these media reports, including NPR. I think he's been treated unfairly. And I didn't see any reason to let him go or to look for somebody else.
Would you agree that a pathologist not taking any photographs during the autopsy is inappropriate?
Their situation, the police took all the photographs. And the police at that time didn't think that this was a foul play case, so they didn't take any photographs.
But a pathologist carrying out an autopsy should document every step they take for purposes of just verifying that they did things appropriately, correct?
Well, sure.
And they should do their best to photograph what they do and notate what they do correctly so that they don't say misstate where a bruise is located on a person, their autopsy.
There wasn't any problem with his autopsy. Now, regarding the photographs, they had a situation where they had a multi-county arrangement, and the people who were responsible for doing all the photography were the police, both in the autopsy suite and at the scene. The police elected not to take the photographs, not Dr. Gill.
You're saying there was no issue with his autopsy in that case?
No.
Would it surprise you that the California bar found him to be incompetent in that case and having done a terrible job on that pathology report?
Well, they're not forensic pathologists, they're attorneys.
So you take no issue with the fact that he misstated where bruises were?
Objection, Your Honor, relevance.
Objections sustained, and we're going to move off the topic of Dr. Gill.
It's fine. Sir, let's talk about how you eventually ended up resigning from Jackson County Medical Examiner's Office. You noted during direct that you had no founded or unfounded issues of essentially malfeasance or incompetence or anything along those lines, correct?
Correct.
And essentially that would lead into no findings of a lack of credibility.
I believe so.
Even unfounded, you said no.
Correct.
Now let's go to this Jessica Harper case. That was a case in 2005 that you became involved with. Are you familiar with that?
I'm familiar with the case, yes, sir.
And in that case, you were actually familiar with her mother.
I knew her mother, yes.
Her name was Elaine, correct?
Yes.
And Elaine worked for the Midwest Transplant Network, if I recall correctly.
Yes, sir.
And Elaine, back in 2005, you have previously noted in discussing that case in the past that she had told you that a defense pathologist had been hired on that case, correct?
Yes.
And that the defense pathologist agreed with the state pathologist in that case.
Correct.
And essentially the state pathologist and defense pathologist up to that point were noting that the injuries to the child's head were so severe that it seemed the top of the head was almost knocked off.
Right.
And you were not hired by Miss Elaine on the Harvard case, correct?
It's usually an attorney that hires me, not usually somebody who's not an attorney.
She or her attorneys did not pay you money to then testify in the Harvard case, correct?
In situations where I did work outside of duty hours, I could bill. I don't recall if I did or not in this particular case. But in the situation here where we're looking at it as basically during county time, and it was the county that billed for it.
Now, as far as your involvement in that case, it was a case out of Kansas State, correct? The Harvard case.
It was a situation here where the incident occurred in Lenexa, Kansas, okay, which is part of the Kansas City metropolitan area on the Kansas side of the state line. There was also some time where the child was in Chillicothe, Missouri. The biological parents who were not living together at the time but basically had the child in Chillicothe 1 week and then the child in Lenexa another week.
Harvard was not prosecuted in Missouri, right?
Kansas, Johnson County, Kansas.
And eventually, when you found out that the defense pathologist agreed with the state pathologist, you noted to Elaine that you would look at the case if she wanted you to.
Sure.
And then you eventually testified at a hearing in 2006, correct?
Yes, sir.
This was after Jessica Harper had pled guilty to second-degree unintentional murder, correct?
She pled no contest.
Or she pled no contest, correct?
No contest.
And this was, your testimony was after that?
The hearing was on whether or not to remove no contest plea and have the case go to trial.
Essentially allow her to withdraw her plea.
Her plea of no contest.
And at least as to testifying in that case, you did testify about using time at the Jackson County Medical Examiner's office to conduct your review, correct?
Sure.
You had actually your assistant, Dr. Thomas Gill, aid you in carrying out that autopsy review?
Yes, and also one other doctor.
And because the defense was not paying you, this was essentially partly on the dime of the Jackson County Medical Office, correct?
Well, Jackson County was getting paid for it.
Jackson County, Missouri was getting paid to conduct this autopsy?
Since we were using Jackson County resources and time, Jackson County was paid for the use of those resources and time.
And by that you mean the essentially taxpayers or the funds of the county would go to your office and that would then cover whatever time you used in the office?
Okay, Jackson County was making money on that. The taxpayers of Jackson County were making money on it.
You did not bill Harbor's defense team for this case at all, did you?
Jackson County did.
Now, at least as to one of your chapters, do you not state that you should avoid doing any work that causes any resources to be used for any outside independent issues that aren't covered by the county?
Okay, and then in this situation, since Jackson County, we were using Jackson County resources and time, Jackson County was being reimbursed for that. There are all kinds of situations here where in civil cases or private or even potentially private matters where we've done autopsies or we've engaged in professional behavior, where if basically Jackson County resources and time are being used, then Jackson County is able to bill for that. And that's what happened here. This is not a situation where I was making money using Jackson County resources. Jackson County was making the money. The taxpayer was making money.
Your supervisor was Catherine Shields, was she not?
Yes.
She had not given you any prior approval to carry this review out, had she?
Correct.
And actually, days later, after you testified, is when 6 different chief prosecutors asked you to resign. Is it not true?
Not true.
You're saying that they did not under oath.
Under oath, I'm telling you that the letter that had to do with Dr. Gill did not even ask him to resign. They just didn't want him to do any they didn't want him to do any homicide autopsies. This basically occurred before the Jessica Harbor situation.
I'm not referencing the letter. I'm asking, after you testified in the Jessica Harbor case in the summer of 2006, didn't different prosecutors ask for you to resign?
Not to my knowledge.
You're saying that no prosecutors asked you to resign?
None.
And in fact, didn't one of those prosecutors then become the supervisor in 2007?
Okay, one of the prosecutors ran for Jackson County executive, which basically would have made him the chief executive officer for Jackson County. Okay, and he is Michael Sanders. He became the Jackson County executive, and I elected not to work for him, so I resigned. Offered my resignation on December 1 of 2006. Gave him a month's notice.
So your testimony today is that you resigned in December 2006, but just because you didn't want to work for this prosecutor turned supervisor.
Correct, sir.
Any approach to the witness?
You may.
Child of the State of Tennessee, if he's still bearing it. Can you review page 21?
Yes, sir.
Isn't it correct that you resigned in 2006 as a result of 6 prosecutors noting complaints that they could not rely on your opinions?
Not correct. What you underlined in that case, which is a document that I think maybe an appellate court in Tennessee wrote, is a misstatement of fact.
You're claiming that this never came up in transcripts, that they relied on to make a decision.
They did not state what was true. That's not what happened.
So this appellate court essentially is wrong.
Yes.
Now, going to your discussions of Dr. Cavaliere, you noted that you believe CPR could have caused further hemorrhages in Cloe, correct?
I don't know. It's unclear. On one hand, I'm forgetting his name.
Corey Binch.
Okay, he said one thing in one place, he said another thing in another place. Exactly what happened on that, I don't know, so I can't say.
During the discussions of circulation during the resuscitation effort, you noted that, at least in one of the documents, it seemed to indicate some circulation was going on.
It might have. I don't know.
And so you don't know whether CPR would have caused any further hemorrhaging.
I don't know.
Discussing with Corey Binch how he carried out that CPR would have allowed you to at least know the possibility of whether there was anything indicating that that hemorrhaging would take place.
I don't know.
You did not interview Corey Binch in any way, correct?
Correct.
And so you couldn't ask him about that possible difference between his report and the testimony you claim reviewed?
Correct.
You noted that all hemorrhages are not specific for anything in your direct testimony, correct?
Okay, repeat the question.
At least hemorrhaging in the neck, it doesn't necessarily have to be specific of anything, correct? That's what you stated in direct or something to that effect?
Sometimes hemorrhages are an indication of specific trauma. And sometimes hemorrhages may be basically an artifact of autopsy. It can go either way.
I believe you at some point noted that they can occur in natural deaths.
Sure.
Now, those natural deaths would be common in, say, a body that's decomposing or prone on the ground for a while.
Those are 2 examples, sure.
Another example would be folks with seizure disorders that would have that type of bleeding in the neck.
I don't know about that.
Prolonged resuscitations, would you agree that those would cause hemorrhaging in the neck?
I don't know about that.
There aren't really any other natural deaths where that type of hemorrhaging in the neck would be found, correct?
In many cases where I've autopsied somebody who has maybe like a sudden cardiac death where they suddenly died, and you do the autopsy, and they have this very, very purple face and neck and shoulders, it's not infrequent there to do an autopsy and find areas of hemorrhage in the neck, and even here areas of hemorrhage in the scalp, and the deep scalp tissues, even though there was no trauma.
You noted that you had never seen a child strangulation case, correct?
Correct.
That's because it's essentially a lot easier to smother a child.
Perhaps.
That would essentially be just because the child is weaker, smaller.
I don't know. Perhaps.
And that there's no child strangulation database, you'd agree with that?
Sure.
So maybe a pathologist that has seen these cases far more frequently versus you've never seen a child strangulation, their experience might inform their opinion differently than yours.
Maybe. I don't know.
Can I have a moment, Your Honor? Now, in a situation, this is just a hypothetical. It's a hypothetical. I think it's been posed before, though I don't like hypotheticals generally. You've seen cases, for instance, in smothering of a child situation, where there's no findings of the autopsy indicating one way or another what happened, but somebody did actually smother that child, correct?
Sure.
And the way you find that out is essentially the person confesses to doing it.
Sure.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Redirect.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, Dr. Young, just kind of going back through some of the things that the state discussed with you during your cross-examination, the majority of your consultation work does in fact come with criminal defense attorneys, correct?
In criminal cases, yes.
Okay. In criminal cases, the state has their own medical examiner and wouldn't necessarily have a need to hire an independent medical examiner. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that.
You were asked questions about a book that you wrote regarding the things that you should do as a medical examiner, right? 22 rules, I believe, correct?
Correct.
And anywhere in that book, does it tell you that you should compromise your ethics in order to get paid?
No, sir.
And not only are you board certified, you also served as a member of the military for this country, correct?
Yes, sir.
Has there ever been a circumstance in your career where you felt compelled by money to compromise your ethics?
Objection,
No, sir.
bolstering.
Sustained bleeding.
Dr. Young, has there ever been a circumstance where you compromised your ethics for money?
No, sir.
Now, if the jury had heard Dr. Cavaliere testify earlier that when a person is asphyxiated, they're generally going, or I'm sorry, let me strike that. When the carotid arteries are impinged, a person can lose consciousness between 3 and 15 seconds. Is that square with your understanding?
Yes, sir.
And you don't disagree with that, do you?
I don't disagree with that.
Ultimately, if that observation led to her opinion that there would not be any thrashing around, do you agree with that opinion?
Okay, I don't understand. Where's the thrashing come from?
Let me rephrase, Dr. Young, just so the jury is clear. Your contention with Dr. Cavaliere isn't that a person is going to lose consciousness in 3 to 15 seconds if their carotid arteries are compromised. You don't take issue with that, correct?
Okay, in a situation where you completely cut off the arterial circulation to the head and you keep it closed off, then you can lose consciousness very, very quickly. What often happens, however, in a strangulation case is that there's a big struggle that takes place, and there are efforts to close those vessels, and then there are also efforts to keep them open. And it's often, frequently during a struggle, that it doesn't seem to fit that kind of clean-cut laboratory situation where an animal will basically lose consciousness in 3 to 15 seconds. Okay? A strangulation is a situation where there's a violent struggle going on, and 2 people are playing a role in it.
Under any circumstance, prior to losing consciousness, in between 3 and 15 seconds, would you expect somebody, if they are fighting to their lives, to struggle in some manner before losing consciousness?
Okay, in a strangulation scenario, you mean?
In any asphyxiation scenario, prior to that person losing consciousness, assuming they don't want to die, would you assume that person would struggle before losing consciousness?
Okay, I don't understand your question. I'm sorry.
Let me strike that. During your cross-examination, doctor, you were asked about some of the literature indicating that there may, in fact, not be marks on the skin in certain scenarios that were presented. Do you recall that
Yes,
questioning?
sir. Yes, sir.
Does may mean that there will never be any marks on the skin in those circumstances?
It's not an all or never sort of thing. Whether or not there are marks frequently have to do in a strangulation setting with how much of a struggle is put up. If you're dealing with an infant that is 3 months old, they're not going to really be able to struggle all that much if the mouth and if the child is being smothered. And so you don't see typically those kinds of things. On the other hand, if you have an older person and there's an attempted strangulation, there is a very violent and vigorous struggle. And with the struggle comes the injuries.
Okay. Now, it's been pointed out, and I believe the state's ultimate point here is that this is only a 5-year-old child. How much struggle are you going to expect from a 5-year-old child?
Oh, I think a 5-year-old child could struggle very vigorously. Consider what it would take if you had a cat and you decided to give the cat a bath. Don't you think the cat, especially one that's not used to taking a bath, wouldn't that struggle? And what if you tried to strangle the cat? Now you could basically overcome the strength of the cat. That doesn't mean that you're not going to get scratched up along the way. And certainly a 5-year-old child is completely capable of doing that if they're being strangled.
Now, during your cross-examination, it was pointed out to you that you've only seen one of these types of cases, and apparently Dr. Cavaliere has seen lots and lots more of these types of cases. Did you understand that questioning?
I remember the questioning.
If Dr. Cavaliere testified that she's personally participated in 23 of these types of cases, does that seem credible to you?
Objection, Your Honor. Prior motion eliminates section 9.
Sustained.
In your experience, Dr. Young, you were the chief medical examiner for how many years in Kansas City?
11 and a half years.
And prior to that, you were an associate medical examiner in Atlanta, Georgia?
Yes, sir.
For how long?
7 years.
And in all of that time, you only had one child hanging death that you can recall, is that correct?
I think there may have been more than one. Maybe about 3 or 4.
Would a number like 23 be extraordinary?
Objection, Your Honor. Same.
Sustained.
Well,
Objection.
Sustained.
I'm sorry.
Response.
Excuse me.
So, Doctor, you've talked a lot about the injuries that you would expect to see in a strangulation death. Knowing that this case was initially reported as a hanging death, do you see any consistencies with a hanging death? Or, I'm sorry, with a strangulation death, I should say.
The case is not consistent with the strangulation.
And why is that again?
Because of strangulation, you see a whole different set of findings than you would in this case. You'd see evidence of the struggle. You'll frequently see evidence of head injury. You'll see petechial hemorrhages in the face and in the linings of the eyes. You'll see hemorrhages in association with broken bones and cartilages in the neck.
And if we can just distinguish, why in strangulation deaths what's the relationship between the hemorrhages in the neck and a strangulation death that you would typically see? Why do you see hemorrhages there?
Well, what is thought to happen there is that it's frequently related to trauma. Okay, there was one point that it was thought to be due to the lack of oxygen, but that's thought to be less and less the case. Part of it is basically the struggle, and you can see petechial hemorrhages in a situation where there's trauma. And strangulation deaths are very traumatic deaths.
Would it be your expectation in a strangulation death to find hemorrhages consistent with the location of, for instance, the thyroid bones fractures and the other cartilage fractures that you would typically see in a strangulation?
Usually if you see fractures in cartilages or the bones in the neck, when you're seeing hemorrhages in association with those fractures, it means that there's still circulating blood, as opposed to a post-mortem situation where there's a break from perhaps handling the body and no bleeding whatsoever.
And what if you see hemorrhages in the neck, but you don't see the corresponding fractures or breaks?
As I've mentioned before, that kind of finding is non-specific. You can even see areas of hemorrhage in natural deaths.
And even when Dr. Cavaliere is testifying about deep tissue hemorrhages, again, that would be non-specific, a non-specific finding?
Yes, particularly if they're in the posterior compartments of the neck, in front of the spine, where you have a large collection of veins. It's not uncommon at an autopsy to see basically artifactual extravasations of blood, especially in those areas. And that's part of the areas that she's describing in her autopsy where to see hemorrhage.
In your opinion, based on your review, is Kelsie Thomas's description of what had happened consistent with the findings that you observed?
Objection asked and answered.
Sustained.
And Dr. Young, just one last topic to discuss with you, just briefly regarding your credentials. There's a lot of discussion about one of your colleagues in Kansas City, Dr. Gill, correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, you personally, you didn't have any problems with alcohol or anything else that related to Dr. Gill, correct?
Correct.
And as you were his colleague, you were aware of potentially some issues with Dr. Gill, but those were monitored, and you didn't have any issue with the job that he did as a forensic pathologist, correct?
Correct.
Now, as I understand, there were prosecuting attorneys who had an issue with Dr. Gill. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And based on those issues, requested that he not participate in homicide investigations. Is that how I understood it?
Yes, sir.
practically speaking, that just was not going to work out for your office, was it?
Correct.
In addition, you felt like you'd be throwing a colleague under the bus. Is that true?
Yes, sir.
The state is couching this in a way that you were forced to resign from your position. Were you forced to resign from your position?
No, sir.
Did anyone at any time ask you to resign your position?
No, sir.
Would it be fair to say that in any appointed job, there are some politics sometimes that people don't want to be involved in?
Okay. That don't want to be involved in?
Well, here, let me ask you this way. Ultimately, you resigned because you did not want to work for who was going to become your new executive supervisor. Is that correct?
Right.
And when I asked you earlier, have you ever been censured or ever had anything done to you based on any unethical behavior or anything that you've done since you become a forensic pathologist, your answer was no, correct?
That was my answer.
And that is still true despite every question that the state asked you, correct?
Leading, argumentative.
Sustain.
That is still true, correct?
Yes.
I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Reed Cross?
Your Honor, I pass the witness, no questions.
Anything else for this witness?
No, Your Honor.
You may sit down. May this witness be excused.
You may.
You may also be excused and leave the courtroom if you choose to do so.
Thank you.